In this video, we're going to talk about production and economic growth. So really the main thing that we're going to be thinking about is what determines the standard of living in a country. Why is it that there are some countries that have high standards of living on average and other countries that have very low standards of living? And we'll also be thinking about what causes the standard of living in a particular country to change over time. What are the ingredients that lead to economic growth? So if we look at, and it kind of depends on the stretch of time that we're thinking about, but if we were to look at real gross domestic product per capita, so in a previous video we've talked about gross domestic product. Remember, that's our measure of the income of people in a country. Gross GDP per capita means income per person. So it's a good measure of kind of the average standard of living in a country. If we were to look at the United States, so over about the last maybe 100 years, the standard of living or the growth rate of real GDP per capita in the U.S. has been a couple of percent, around 2%. Now, if you were to limit that to just, say, the last 40 years or maybe the last 50 years, it's been higher. It's been maybe 4 to 5%, some years higher than that, some years lower than that. If you were to look at China, say, over just the last 40 years, maybe 30 years, their growth rate's been even higher than that. It's been upwards around 8 to 9%. And again, it depends on the time period that you dice it down into. If you take certain short periods of time, you can get very different numbers. But on the other hand, there are some places like Zimbabwe where standards of living have actually declined over time. So over here, we're going to put a picture that just lists some countries and it lists some time periods. Typically those time periods are going to be around the late 1800s or 1900s up until about 2017. Things have changed a little bit with COVID, and so these numbers, if we were to look at current numbers, they'd be a little bit different, but we're not really interested in the exact number. We're really more interested right now in what's happened over time. So if you take a look at this picture, you can see that standards of living vary widely, both at the beginning time period and at the end time period. So those countries on the list there are ranked by growth rate. You can see that over this time period that we're talking about, China has had the highest growth rate per year, 2.64%. There are lots of countries that are not included on this list, obviously. At the bottom of the list has been the United Kingdom, growth rate of 1.43%. So you can see there that several countries have improved dramatically. So China has improved dramatically. If you look at their real GDP per capita at the beginning and at the end, that's a pretty dramatic improvement. Japan, Germany, and then some have not. If you look at Pakistan and Bangladesh, they have not improved dramatically. You can also see that the United Kingdom was, in terms of per capita real GDP at the beginning of the time period, the richest nation, but not anymore. So over time, rich countries can become richer, typically. We tend typically to see countries that don't start out as being wealthy countries. Typically over time what we've seen is that they've become wealthier, not all of them. Let's talk for a second now about kind of a useful tool, and this has come up in other videos. If you've watched my other videos, you've probably seen me talk about something that we call the rule of 72. It can be a good way to help understand the importance of changes in the growth rate. So sometimes, depending on if you're in maybe a finance class, or there are other times when people use a slightly different rule. So there's another rule known as the rule of 70. I've seen the rule of 69 before. For what we're going to do, and there are appropriate uses for those, all of them are going to give you a similar answer. And so what we're interested in is just getting an answer that gets us in the right ballpark. And so we're going to use the rule of 72, even though you could use the rule of 70 and be just fine. So here's the idea behind the rule of 72. It really just kind of gives you an idea, a way of understanding how many years it takes a dollar amount to double, depending upon the growth rate. So for example, if the way you use it is the number of years to doubling is going to be equal to 72 divided by the growth rate. I'm going to call it G. So if the growth rate in a country is 1%, then the number of years it's going to take standards of living to double in that country is going to be 72 divided by 1. It's going to take about 72 years, neighborhood of 72 years, for standards of living to double. Now in the table we saw that some of these countries had growth rates of 2%, 2.5%. I mentioned before that the United States has had 3, 4, 5% in recent decades. China has had 8, 9%. So let's take 10%. If we had a country that was growing at a rate of 10%, then 72 divided by 10 is 7.2, right? That means that standards of living are going to double every 7.2 years. Let's go back to our 1% growth rate. At 1% growth rate, it takes 72 years. At 2% growth rate, it's going to take 36 years. So you can see that going from 1% to 2% growth has a dramatic impact. It immediately cuts the amount of time to doubling in half. So it's important to understand that even very small changes in these growth rates can have huge impacts over time. It's tempting for a lot of students to think that the difference between 1% growth and 2% growth is just 1%, right? It's 1 versus 2, but it's not. It's 100% more growth, okay? So let's also talk about a useful way to calculate real GDP per capita growth rate. So let me put an equation up here that will help us as we think about figuring out what growth rates are going to look like. So let's say real GDP, real gross domestic product, per capita growth rate. So this is going to be equal to the growth rate in nominal GDP. So I'm going to put nominal GDP growth rate minus the inflation rate minus population growth rate. It's just right. Population growth rate. Now the first part of this, there's a minus sign right there. The first part of this, these three terms right here may look familiar to you. You may have seen in a different video where we talked about if you want to calculate real interest rate, you've got to take the nominal interest rate and subtract off the inflation rate. This is similar to that, only we're not talking about interest rates here. We're talking about growth rates, and this is growth rate of per capita. So this is per person. That means we have to add this term that adjusts for changes in the population. So if you've got the change in the growth rate in nominal GDP, and you would calculate all of these as the percent change. Remember your percent change, if you're going to calculate a percent change, the way you calculate that is it's a fraction, a ratio of two things. In the numerator we have how much it changed by, and then we divide by the starting value, and then we multiply by 100 to move the decimal point a couple places to the right. So all of these would be calculated as a percent change. So what this means is if you've got the percent change, the growth rate of nominal GDP, and what you're after is how much did real incomes grow by, then we have to subtract off the inflation rate over the time period that we're talking about, minus the population growth rate, and that's going to give us the growth rate of real GDP per capita. So there are going to be times when you may need to use that. Now, let's start talking about productivity. So remember, our goal here is to start to understand what causes growth. And so if you think about differences across country, or you think about changes in the growth rate for a particular country over time, the thing that's going to change or cause there to be differences in growth is going to be productivity. And one of the best ways to think about this, I think, is to think of what a lot of textbooks call the Robinson Crusoe example. So if you think about the novel by Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, basically Robinson was a sailor trapped on a desert island and basically had to become self-sufficient. So Robinson is completely responsible for catching fish and growing any food that he wants and making clothing. So now let's think about that situation. Let's pretend we think about the situation that Robinson is in. So what determines Robinson's standard of living at that point? Well, it's going to be his productivity, right? It's going to be how many fish can Robinson catch? And it's going to be Robinson's ability to grow vegetables and ability to make food. And that can change over time, right? So he can increase his standard of living by becoming more productive. Now this is also true for an economy. So if we were to think about something that you've probably seen in another video of mine or at another point, if you've studied some economics, you've probably talked about a production possibilities frontier, a PPF. So a PPF typically looks like this. So we have some output good, I'm just going to call it Q1, and another output good, Q2, and then a production possibilities frontier typically looks like that. And so this is used to represent all of the production possibilities, all of the combinations of Q1 and Q2 that this economy can possibly produce, given its inputs and given its technology. So the inputs would be land, labor, capital, that kind of stuff. And then given the technology that it can use to combine those inputs into output. So we know that the economy can produce any of these combinations inside the production possibility frontier or any of these combinations on the production possibilities frontier. They're going to want to be on the production possibilities frontier because we want to get the most out of the resources that we've got, but they can't produce any point outside of this production possibilities frontier. So this is the same idea. There's going to be a limit on what Robinson Crusoe can produce, and the limit to Robinson Crusoe's standard of living is going to be whatever they can produce. So now if we think about what it would mean, let's suppose that Robinson Crusoe is on this island for an extended period of time, and over time he becomes better at catching fish, or he develops maybe some techniques that allow him to produce clothing quicker, or maybe grow vegetables better. Then productivity is going up there. And if we were to think about how we would represent a change in productivity in this picture, then you probably know that this production possibilities frontier can shift. It could shift out in one direction or the other direction or both directions. So we could have a shift maybe that looks something like this. It doesn't have to shift out the same amount in both directions. So what this means is that something has changed that will allow now this economy to produce a set of bundles in this little sliver right here or on this new PPF that they couldn't have produced before. That can be more inputs, maybe they get more labor, or it could be a change in technology, a technological improvement that allows them to produce more with the inputs that they've got. So in order to understand what is going to affect, say, the situation that Robinson Crusoe's in or the situation that an economy is, we need to understand what are the things that affect productivity. And so let's just run through the things that typically we think about as having an impact on the productivity. Now I'm going to be thinking about a nation or an economy, but we can think about this as working for, as I said, Robinson Crusoe. The first thing we're going to think about would be, say, physical capital per worker. Physical capital per worker. So if each worker has more capital to work with than before, then that's going to cause them to be more productive. So if they have more tools or better tools, then they're going to be able to produce more. So same with Robinson Crusoe, right? If Robinson Crusoe had, all of a sudden there were some fishing poles there where there weren't before, then he's going to be able to catch more fish. Or if he comes up with an idea for a great tool that would help him in farming, then that new implement is going to increase his productivity. So now let's think about physical capital. The terminology that we use in an economics class would be, or let's say that what we're typically thinking about is going to be equipment and structures. Equipment and structures. And the terminology that we use for that is investment. So you've probably, if you've studied economics, you've probably heard a conversation where somebody said, look, a lot of times when we think about investment out there in the real world, a lot of people think about buying stocks and bonds. But in an economics class, that's not the way that we use the word investment. We're thinking about investment as being when businesses purchase equipment and structures. Okay? So now capital, physical capital, think about how this is different from other inputs. So physical capital is an input that used to be an output, right? So it's different from labor, or it's different from natural resources. Physical capital is something that was produced to produce other stuff, okay? It's an input that was once an output. So physical capital is going to be an important determinant of productivity. Second one, we can think of human capital. So human capital per worker. So here we're talking about really knowledge and skills. And workers get knowledge and skills through training, through education, through experience. So as Robinson Crusoe is on this island for longer stretches of time, he's going to gain knowledge about the right ways to do things and improve the skills that he has to catch fish and make clothing and grow vegetables, that kind of stuff. So obviously human capital per worker is going to be an important determinant of productivity. We can also think about natural resources per worker. Natural resources per worker. So here we're thinking about land, rivers, mineral deposits. And those mineral deposits can be renewable, things like clean air, clean water. The world's ecosystems are really, really good at cleaning water. It can be polluted up to certain amounts. I mean, we have the ability to pollute water to where it can't be used again. But if we don't reach that amount, you can pollute it. And then the earth itself, the ecosystem is going to clean it and make it usable again. So trees would be another example of a renewable resource. Or a resource could be non-renewable, something like oil, where once you use it, it's done. You can't reuse it. It's not necessary for an economy to have a lot of natural resources to become or to have a high standard of living. So for example, Japan has relatively few natural resources and relatively high standards of living. So that's not a necessary ingredient because natural resources can be imported into the country. Another determinant of productivity is going to be technical knowledge. So that's obviously going to be an important determinant. So this is just going to be understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. Right? So this is really what allows a relatively small number of farmers in the United States to produce all of the food that we need in the United States and then export food to the rest of the world. Technical knowledge has increased dramatically in agricultural production over the last century and before that. So this is similar to human capital, right? Human capital is really the learning of the knowledge down here. So those are closely related. So those are going to be important determinants of how productive workers are. Let's talk for a second about something that you may have seen in another class, and that would be a production function. This is another way that we can think about productivity. So if we talk about a production function, I'm going to write a general version of a production function. So let's suppose we have y. We're going to use y to stand for output. I'm going to have the number a here. That's just going to be a number. If we want to get fancy, we could call it a scalar, but the word scalar is just a fancy word for the for number. So don't be confused by that. A, and then we're going to have some function f. Okay, and then inside there we're going to have labor, which we designate L. We're going to have capital, which we designate K. H we're going to use to stand for human capital, and then N we're going to use to stand for natural resources. So we've got labor, capital, human capital, this is going to be physical capital, human capital, and natural resources. So what this says is the amount of output that we can produce is some function. Here F, we could write this F as just some general function. Okay? Don't worry about what version that looks like, what mathematical form it takes. We're not going to worry about that in this chapter. If you were to go on and talk more about production theory and maybe the costs of production, then you'd worry about that. But for what we're doing, we don't need to think about it. So this really, A here, represents productivity. A represents productivity. So the higher A is, the more output we get out of these inputs. So these are our inputs, there's our output. This production function represents the technical part of how the inputs combine to turn into output, but A here is going to represent productivity. Okay? So increasing the amount of output that we use, if we were to increase labor, or if we were to increase capital, or if we were to increase human capital or natural resources, that's going to allow us to produce more output. And we can think about graphically representing the amount of output that we can produce as a function of the amount of input that we use. If we were to put output up here and say put the amount of labor that we use down here, then we could think about the relationship, and it's probably going to look something like this. This would be what we would call a production function. So this is the mathematical representation of a production function, a general mathematical representation. And this would be a graphical representation of that production function. So you can see that increasing the amount of labor increases the amount of output that we can produce, but it's increasing it at a decreasing rate. So if we're down here and we increase the amount of labor that we use, we get a bigger increase in output than if we're up here. And really, we would think about this, we're not going to make too much of this right now, we would think about this as a short-run production function. So the idea here is that you're increasing labor, but you're holding these other things constant. And so what happens is output increases at a decreasing rate because of something that we call the law of diminishing marginal product. So I'm going to say law of diminishing marginal product. If you're not 100% sure what we mean by that, don't worry about it. It's not that important right now. If you want to know more about that, then what you should do is you should go check out the video I've got on the costs of production. The idea is that if you're holding the amount of these other inputs constant, like say for example physical capital, and you're just adding more labor, then the laborers have to start sharing capital, they have to share space, everybody's productivity is going to go down. You may have heard the saying, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Well, that's a way of saying the law of diminishing marginal product without sounding like an economist. So now let's think about what would happen if instead of holding some of these inputs constant, we just think about changing all of the inputs. So if we're talking about the long run, where nothing is fixed, we can think about changing this slightly. Let's rewrite it this way. I'm going to write it as A times F. I'm going to reverse the order of this. I'm going to put my Y over here. A times F is equal to X times L. I'll explain what I'm doing there in just a second. X times capital, X times human capital, X times natural resources equals X times Y. So let's think about what that means for right now. So the X there, I'm just thinking about changing the amount of inputs that we've got. So if we were to say, treat X as if it's 2, then all that means is we're using twice the amount of labor, twice the amount of capital, twice the amount of human capital, twice the amount of natural resources, and what we get out of that is twice the amount of output. Not all production processes are like that. It could be that if you double the amount of inputs that you use, you get more than double the amount of output. Could be that if you double the amount of inputs that you use, you get less than double the amount of output. If you get exactly X, if we double inputs and that results in a doubling of output, then we call that constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale. If you double inputs and you get more than double the output, we would call that increasing returns to scale. And you can probably figure out if you double input and you get less than double the amount of output, we call that decreasing returns to scale. Let's talk about now some limits to growth. Limits to growth. So there are several people out there that would make the argument that standards of living can't continue to increase because at some point we're going to run out of the natural resources that we've got. If you want a good example of that, there was a researcher named Jay Forrester. And Jay Forrester did a lot of work in the early 70s. And a lot of that work ended up leading to a book that was called The Limits to Growth. And then there was another book called Beyond the Limits that I believe was published at some point in the early 90s. And basically what those books said is that given the number of people that we've got on this earth and given the resources that we've got to work with, we have exceeded our ability to continue things as they are. There are limits to growth, and in Beyond the Limits, the argument was made that society will collapse. We're going to reach a point when we all of a sudden are going to realize that we are out of resources, and that's going to lead to the complete collapse of civilization. Of course, we're still around, so you know that those predictions did not happen. The problem with those is that they ignore what has actually happened in the world, and that is that we have had incredibly dramatic changes in technology. Technology has improved in ways that we never imagined possible, say, 50 years ago. And there is no reason to believe that somehow that's going to end. So, if you assume that technology is not going to increase, then yeah, that you get, we are beyond the limits to growth. There's probably going to be collapse. That's not the way that things work. Those models that the limits to growth were based on were also models that ignored things that we know about basic human behavior. So, for example, we know that as things get scarce, their price tends to go up. As the supply curve shifts to the left, that drives price up. So when things get scarce, price tends to rise. Now, as price tends to rise, what we know is that people respond to that by decreasing quantity demanded. When price goes up, we want less of it. If you assume that that's not going to happen, then as price goes up, as things become scarce, if you assume that people aren't going to want less of it, then you're going to be left with nothing but the conclusion that things are going to collapse. Well, but we know that that's not how humans behave. What we've seen is that as resources become scarce, that creates an incentive for people to go out and find more. That increasing price creates a bigger reward to finding more of the resource or finding better ways to use it so that we don't have to use as much as we used to. And it creates an incentive for people to want to use less of it. So, again, what we know about human behavior is that people don't behave the way that they assumed, that Jay Forrester assumed in those studies. You can look at the world around us and know that that's not, what they predicted is not happening. If resources were becoming more scarce, we would be observing increases in the price of resources, and for most resources we are not. We're actually observing decreases in real terms in the price of those resources over time. So, human ingenuity is the thing that causes us to know that there's probably not any obvious limits to what we can achieve in the future. Does that mean we need to be cavalier about how we use things and just waste it? Of course not. But then that's what we know about human behavior, that scarcity drives prices up, which affects our behavior. All right, let's talk about economic growth and public policy. So our goal here is to understand growth, and we've talked about the things that are determinants of growth. They're right here. Let's talk for a little bit about public policy that might encourage growth. So one of the things that we can think about right off the bat would be physical capital. We can think about investment. So I'm going to call this saving, let's say saving and investment. So we know, I just said a little bit ago, that investment is when businesses buy capital. So policies that encourage saving and investment are going to result in more capital, which increases productivity, which then tends to increase the growth rate of real GDP. The challenge to that is that if we engage in investment now, that decreases the amount of consumption we engage in right now. So more resources put towards investment means that we have to delay consumption until the future, and that can be challenging for people to do. If you've seen my other videos, you may have seen the video on saving and investment, and so you may know that there are some policies that the government can enact that will increase or decrease the amount of saving and investment that is done in the economy. So unfortunately, what we tend to see is that a lot of governments will create incentives that discourage saving. So for example, a capital gains tax. A capital gains tax means that some of the reward to saving gets taken away from you. It gets taxed away. Well, if you do that, if you decrease the reward to saving, there will be less saving and consequently less investment. And so all other things equal, we have to be careful about having capital gains taxes, say, that are too high. Then there are incentives like investment tax credits that can increase, that can give businesses an incentive to engage in more investment. So I talk about those in a different video. Let's talk about another policy, and that would be, say, or let's actually just talk about diminishing returns. And I'm going to put in here diminishing returns and the catch-up effect. Catch-up effect. So let's think about what happens if we increase or if we engage in policies that increase the amount of capital. Actually, what I need to do is I need to clear this off and kind of start fresh. So I'm going to clear this off and then we'll come back and talk about that. So let's think about pursuing a policy that increases the capital stock, so the amount of physical capital that we've got. So we know that that's going to increase productivity. In the longer run, it's going to create more rapid growth in GDP. But how long is that growth going to last? Let's think about that for a second. If we were to draw a picture that's similar to one that we had up here, let's put a output per worker. And then let's put over here, instead of labor, let's put capital per worker. We've got a production function here. So now let's think about how capital per worker affects output. As we increase capital per worker, output's going up, but it's going up at a decreasing rate. So we're getting more output per worker, but not as much as out here as we do down here. So if we think about increasing capital per worker, I'm going to draw a little horizontal line. Let's suppose we start right here with this much capital per worker and we increase it. Then what we're going to get out of that is going to be that much more output per worker. We increased capital per worker by this amount, we get that much output per worker as in return. Let's do that over here. So if we were to increase it by the same amount, I'm going to draw a little arrow the same distance right there. Increase capital per worker. Now we're starting from a situation where we've already got more capital per worker than we have down here. And so what we see is the return that we get out of that in terms of output per worker is smaller. Okay, so the result, what we're seeing here is that the higher savings rate, which is going to result in a higher amount of investment, isn't going to lead to as big a reward out here. So if you're talking about a country that has a relatively high capital per worker compared to a country with a relatively low capital per worker, then, and they both increase the amount of capital per worker that they've got, typically what this would tell us is that the amount of output is going to increase much more dramatically in the country that starts out with the lower capital per worker. They're going to start to catch up fast, right? And so that's what we call the catch-up effect. It's easier for a country to grow fast if it starts out relatively poor. You may see in other places, you may see this called convergence. And so this is really an empirical question, is do we observe convergence? Is it the case that when countries that are relatively poor grow faster than countries that are relatively rich. It's empirical, and there's evidence for it. There's evidence against it. You can, if you're interested in that, you can do some searches, and you'll find plenty of information on it. We can talk about other policies. So, for example, we could talk about investment from abroad. Investment from abroad. So foreigners can engage in investment in our country, or we can engage in investment in another country. So let's suppose that a U.S. company builds a factory, say in Mexico. We've got a name for that. We would call that foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment. Or we could think about somebody in the U.S. buying stock in a Mexican corporation. That would be called foreign portfolio investment. In both cases, what's happening is that Americans are providing resources to increase the capital stock in Mexico, right? And so this happens all over the world. There are people from other countries that buy stocks in American countries, and people in America that buy stocks in countries in corporations all around the world. And then there are businesses that say we'll build a factory in other places. And a lot of times people are skeptical of this. I guess maybe it's just natural for people to wonder, okay, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So, for example, it could be that a Chinese firm builds a plant in the U.S., or Chinese citizens buy shares of stock in U.S. corporations. A lot of times people will say, hold it, wait, is that good for a Chinese citizen to be engaging in that type of purchase of things here? And so let's just talk about the effect that has. So let's go back to our example where the U.S. company builds a factory in Mexico, or a U.S. citizen builds or buys a share of stock in a Mexican corporation. So those activities will increase productivity in Mexico and consequently increase GDP in Mexico. But not in the same way as if it was done by Mexican citizens. Some of the income from that behavior is going to go back to the U.S. So the company that builds the factory, it's going to increase productivity and it's going to increase GDP there, but some of that income from that behavior is going to come back to the U.S. And if a U.S. citizen buys a share of stock, which represents partial ownership in that corporation in Mexico, well, dividends are going to come back. Some of the profits are going to come back to the person in the United States that bought it. So it still results in growth. And typically economists who are serving as policy advisors to countries will advocate for removing restrictions on foreign ownership. Because even though the impact is not as big, it still has a positive impact on growth and a positive impact on GDP. Another policy thing that we can think about would be, say, education. So investing in human capital is at least as important as investing, I would argue, in physical capital. If you look at, say, education in the United States, it's estimated that each year of schooling tends to increase future wage by around 10%. And so going to school, getting education, or getting skills, it doesn't have to be book learning, it can be going to a trade school. Those things tend to increase future wage, but you have to also remember that if you're sitting in a classroom for a year, there's an opportunity cost of that. It obviously costs what you're going to pay in tuition and books and that kind of stuff. But there's a bigger cost, and the bigger cost is that if you're sitting in a classroom for a year or 4 years, then you're not working a job for a year or 4 years. And so you have to factor that into the cost. And if you went out and got a job, even at working at $10 an hour, that's $20,000. So the cost of getting that education, there's an opportunity cost right now. But what we tend to know is that it typically pays off. It's also the case that that education creates externalities. An externality is when one person's behavior imposes a cost on another person, or when one person's behavior gives another person a benefit. With the cost, we would call it a negative externality. With a benefit, we would call it a positive externality. I've got a video on externalities and public goods, so if you want to know more about how externalities work, you can take a look at that. But education creates a positive externality for people other than the person that's being educated. When more people are educated, we tend to have better decisions made society-wide. It just creates a better environment for other people to live in. So education is going to be important. Another one that's going to be important would be, we could say, health and nutrition. So from a policy perspective, it would be good to encourage policies that result in people taking better care of their health, eating better. You can look at countries with relatively low standards of living, and you will typically observe a link between low levels of nutrition and countries with relatively low standards of behavior, because it's hard to be productive when you're in poor health. It's hard to be productive when you aren't consuming enough calories to engage in a day's worth of labor. So policies that encourage or that improve the health and nutrition of workers, increase productivity, increases the growth rate of real GDP. We can also think about property rights. Property rights and political stability. These are very important. So in order for markets to work well, there has to be a well-defined set of property rights. There's very little incentive to be productive. If you know that if you're productive today, and tomorrow somebody comes along and steals what you made, and there's no way that you can get it back, then you're not going to be productive. So what we tend to see is that in situations where property rights are not well protected, we tend to see people be relatively lowly productive, not as productive. In situations where there's political instability, we tend to see people not be as productive. So most economists would agree that one of the most important functions of government is to establish property rights, a well-defined set of property rights, create a legal system that protects those property rights, and then engage in behavior where political stability is encouraged. When you have economies where there's a lot of corruption, a lot of bribery, we also tend to see those have relatively low levels of growth in real GDP. So we want to see less of that. Another policy thing that would lead to higher levels of growth would be, say, free trade. Countries that restrict trade tend to not do as well as countries that do not restrict trade. So, for example, if you look at, say, Argentina, many decades ago, Argentina went to a set of policies that were more inwardly based policies, reduced interaction with other countries. And if you look at how well Argentina did over those years, not well at all. Restricting trade does not increase well-being. In fact, if you've watched some of my other videos, especially if you've watched the video on 10 principles of economics, you know that one of the basic principles is that free trade can increase human well-being. That doesn't mean that all free trade increases the well-being of everyone. That's not what we're saying. But all other things equal, we would rather see more free trade rather than less. So if you want to see more on that, take a look at either that 10 principles video, or there's a video on the gains from trade. That would be a good one to take a look at. Let's talk about research and development. Research and development. So it is good policy to encourage research and development. And lots of countries do this, typically through, say, funding of grants for research, or through the establishment of a patent system that protects your rights if you come up with a new idea or a new invention. If you look at the amount of technological progress that we've experienced over time, a vast majority of that has come from private research. It's been the result of what businesses have done and inventors. It's a vast majority of the amount of technological progress that we've experienced has not come about because of the government. In fact, governments are notoriously bad at not being able to pick winners. So it typically happens through private research, but the government can encourage that and can provide grants to engage in. That's not to say government has never come up with great ideas. NASA has created a tremendous amount of technological progress. It's just that private research tends to create a lot more. But the government has a role to play in encouraging those things. Again, through grants for research, through protecting property rights in the form of patents. We can also talk about, say, population growth. This is an important issue when we start thinking about human well-being and productivity and growth and standards of living. And really, the effect of population growth is uncertain. So on the one hand, if you have more workers, that means you can produce more output. On the other hand, if you've got more workers, that means you've got more people consuming that output. And so it's not clear, it's not completely obvious whether having more workers helps you or hurts you. In fact, if you go back and you look at, say, the early 1800s, there was an economist named Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus wrote a treatise in which he argued that population growth is going to result in indefinite poverty for the world's population. His argument was this: our ability to grow food is limited much more than our ability to increase population. Population growth happens faster than food growth. And so his conclusion was that we are destined to live in poverty forever. We're not going to be able to grow enough food to feed the world's population. So what we need to do is we need to limit the world's population. Turns out Thomas Malthus was dramatically wrong. Completely wrong for a similar reason that Jay Forrester was completely wrong, and that is that he completely underestimated the amount of technological progress that we experience. So let's just say population growth. It's not clear exactly what to do with that. Let's finish up by talking just a little bit about what has come to be known as growth accounting. Growth accounting. So one thing, we've talked about the important characteristics of growth, of productivity. We've talked about some public policies related to encouraging those. We could also start to talk about, well, what are the most important things? What should we pay the most attention to? We can think about the growth rate of real GDP. We can separate out the kind of the components of that into the contribution of of labor and the contribution of capital and the contribution of technology by using this statement. I'm going to say G with a little y there. That's going to stand for the growth rate of output. It's equal to the growth rate of technology, which I'm going to put that little A there. Remember previously we had technology as being represented by A, plus that A, a lowercase a, multiplied by the growth rate of capital, GK, plus 1 minus A multiplied by the growth rate of labor. Now, A, again, this A stands for technology. This A, right there, that's the amount of, or the share of output that goes to capital. So share of output that goes to capital. This would then represent the share of output that goes to labor, L. So if, let's say, 1/3, if A was 1/3, 1/3 of the output that was produced in the economy goes to capital, then 2/3 would go to labor. This plus that add up to 1. Okay? So this gives us a good way if we're thinking about how fast capital is growing, how fast labor is growing, how fast technology is growing. And then we can think about the share of output that goes to both capital and labor. This gives us a good way of thinking about how fast output is going to grow. Of course, we can use this if we know any of these things. If there's one of these things that we don't know and we know the rest, we can solve for the thing that we don't know. So if you are taking a test or working a homework where you are doing a problem like this, you should be prepared not to be given all of these things so that you can calculate that. You should be prepared to be given, let's say, the A and then 3 of the 4 G's and calculate the other one. Okay? So hopefully that gives you an idea of the things that lead to growth in a country, the policies that we can engage in that would encourage growth. So I'll see you in another video.